Look, we've all seen the movies, right? Glorious Roman legions, shining armor, heroic charges. It all looks incredibly cinematic. But let's be brutally honest for a second. That's just Hollywood fantasy. The Roman battlefield? That was a meat grinder. A screaming, blood-soaked, utterly terrifying meat grinder. Do you seriously think you could last even an hour there? Forget a full day, forget 24 hours. Most guys didn't make it past the first clash of shields. This isn't some historical documentary for tourists. This is the grim reality of ancient warfare. If you've got the stomach for it, if you really want to know what it felt like to be a piece of flesh in that ancient grinder, then stick around, because we're about to put you through it. The Roman gladius was not designed for elegant dueling or dramatic sweeps. It was a short, sharp, thrusting weapon, optimized for brutal, close-quarters combat. In the tightly packed formations of the Roman legion, particularly the testudo, tortoise formation, or the general engagement of maniples, there was no room for fancy swordplay. The gladius was a stabbing tool, meant to punch through gaps in armor, target soft tissue, and deliver quick, fatal wounds. Its efficiency lay in its simplicity, a rapid series of thrusts designed to bypass shields and incapacitate opponents with minimal effort. This was industrial-scale killing, designed to maximize casualties in the shortest possible time. The design of the gladius, typically around 20-24 inches in length with a broad, tapering blade, facilitated swift, powerful thrusts that could penetrate deeply. Its dual-edged design also allowed for cutting motions, but its primary function in the tight Roman battle lines was undoubtedly thrusting. The training with the gladius focused on precision and economy of motion. Legionaries practiced relentlessly with wooden swords against a palace, training post, learning to deliver powerful, accurate thrusts to vital areas. This drilling ingrained a muscle memory for efficient killing, ensuring that every movement counted. The short length of the gladius made it ideal for fighting within the confines of a shield wall, where longer swords would be cumbersome and less effective. A legionary could thrust under an enemy's shield, into their groin, or between their ribs with devastating speed. This intimate, brutal form of combat favored the disciplined and well-trained Roman soldier, who was accustomed to fighting in tight formations, shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. The gladius was an extension of the legionary's will, a direct tool for achieving the objective of breaking and routing the enemy. The gladius's relatively lightweight also contributed to its speed and the legionary's ability to deliver multiple thrusts in rapid succession without tiring quickly. This sustained offensive capability was a key factor in Roman combat superiority, allowing them to maintain relentless pressure on their adversaries. Furthermore, the gladius was often used in conjunction with the Roman scutum, a large rectangular shield. The legionary would use his scutum to create an opening in the enemy's defense, either by pushing forward or by deflecting an attack, and then immediately follow up with a quick, decisive thrust from the gladius. This synchronized action, practiced thousands of times on the training ground, made the Roman legionary a highly effective and lethal combatant. The gladius was a weapon of mass casualty, designed for a military system that prioritized overwhelming force and disciplined execution over individual heroics. Its effectiveness was not in its aesthetic appeal, but in its raw, unadorned ability to end lives quickly and efficiently, contributing directly to the Roman army's reputation for ruthlessness and invincibility on the battlefield. The sound of hundreds of gladi thrusting in unison through the chaos of battle must have been a terrifying symphony to Rome's adversaries, a chilling promise of swift and brutal demise. The standardized nature of the gladius, from its dimensions to its metallurgical properties, ensured uniformity in combat performance across all legions, an early example of military-industrial standardization. Before the gladius even came into play, the Roman pilum would rain down. This heavy javelin, often with a soft iron shaft that bent on impact, was designed not just to kill, but to render an enemy's shield useless. Imagine hundreds, even thousands, of these projectiles slamming into your ranks, either piercing your shield and making it cumbersome, or worse, embedding themselves in your flesh. The psychological impact alone was devastating, forcing enemy formations to break just as the disciplined Roman lines advanced, a calculated opening move in a deadly ballet. The pilum was a sophisticated piece of engineering for its time. Its heavy head and long, slender shaft provided excellent penetration, and the ingenious design of the soft iron shank prevented enemies from simply throwing the javelin back. Once bent, it was effectively useless to the opponent, denying them a valuable projectile weapon. This unique design feature was a critical tactical advantage, preventing the enemy from repurposing Roman weaponry against them. Each legionary typically carried 2 pila, one heavy and one lighter, allowing for a staggered volley or a follow-up throw. The initial volleys were designed to sow chaos and disruption in the enemy's ranks. The sheer number of pila thrown simultaneously created a deadly hail that was almost impossible to defend against completely. Even if a pilum did not inflict a direct casualty, its impact on a shield could be equally devastating. A shield with a pilum embedded in it became unwieldy and unbalanced, forcing the enemy soldier to either discard it, leaving them exposed, or to fight with a compromised defense. This strategic disabling of enemy shields was a brilliant tactical maneuver, as shields were crucial for protection in ancient warfare. By undermining the enemy's primary defensive tool, the Romans effectively softened up their opponents for the subsequent gladius charge. The trajectory of the pilum, often thrown from relatively close range, 30-50 feet, ensured a powerful downward arc that would maximize its chances of piercing or embedding in an enemy shield. The psychological warfare aspect of the pilum volley cannot be overstated. The thunderous impact of thousands of javelins, the sight of comrades falling, and the sudden loss of protective shields would induce panic and disarray. This disruption was precisely what the Romans aimed for. As enemy formations wavered and broke under the pilum assault, the disciplined Roman legions would advance, maintaining their tight ranks, ready to engage with their gladi. The pilum, therefore, was not merely a projectile weapon. It was an integral part of the Roman shock and awe tactic. It set the stage for the close quarters combat, creating vulnerabilities that the gladius-wielding legionaries could exploit. It was the precursor to the main event, a powerful statement of Roman military might that often determined the outcome of a battle before the two forces even truly clashed. The pilum was the ultimate warning shot, a harbinger of the brutal efficiency that was about to descend upon Rome's enemies. The disciplined timing of the pilum throw, often followed by a concerted charge, left the enemy little time to recover or reorganize. While the basic design of the pilum remained consistent, it underwent several changes throughout Roman history. Early versions, for instance, featured a wooden shaft with a barbed iron head, but this design evolved into the more famous type with a long, thin iron shank. This innovation, which made the pilum so effective at bending upon impact, is often attributed to the reforms of Gaius Marius. The Marian reforms, which professionalized the Roman army, standardized equipment and tactics, making the pilum an even more formidable weapon in the hands of a well-trained legionary. The weapon's effectiveness was so renowned that it remained a staple of the Roman army for centuries, adapting to the changing face of warfare. Its legacy can be seen in later Roman javelins, which, while different in design, maintained the core principle of a long-range projectile meant to disrupt and disable before the main engagement. The pilum's effectiveness was also due to the rigorous training of the Roman legions. Soldiers were drilled extensively in the art of throwing the pilum in unison, creating a more concentrated and devastating volley. This collective discipline transformed a simple javelin throw into a coordinated act of mass destruction. Moreover, the lightweight and longer second pilum allowed for greater range and a follow-up strike on a retreating or disorganized enemy. This versatility was key to the Roman military success, as it allowed them to adapt to different battlefield situations. The combination of a heavy shield-disabling pilum and a lighter, longer-range one provided a comprehensive projectile arsenal that few ancient armies could match. The pilum was a testament to the Roman genius for combining simple, effective technology with disciplined, large-scale tactics to achieve unparalleled military dominance. The battlefield was a horrifying sensory overload. The clash of steel on steel, the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground, the guttural roars of charging men, and, most hauntingly, the screams of the wounded and dying created an infernal symphony. Roman military discipline was so rigorous that legionaries were trained to ignore these cacophonous sounds, to focus solely on the man in front of them, in the commands of their centurions. But could you? Could you maintain your composure as men around you gurgled their last breaths in the air filled with the stench of blood, sweat, and excrement? The sheer volume of noise was disorienting, designed to break the morale of less disciplined armies. Imagine the metallic ring of swords on shields, the scraping sound of armored men moving in unison, the snapping of bone, and the high-pitched shriek of men in agony, all blending into a terrifying, immersive soundscape. This constant, overwhelming auditory assault was a deliberate, if unstated, element of Roman battlefield psychology. This sensory assault was compounded by the visual horror. The sight of dismembered limbs, spilled entrails, and the contorted faces of the dead and dying would test the strongest of wills. Yet Roman training emphasized maintaining formation, adhering to orders, and continuing the fight regardless of the surrounding carnage. This level of psychological conditioning was not accidental. It was painstakingly cultivated through repetitive drills, brutal punishments, and the fostering of a collective identity that prioritized the legion's success above individual survival or emotional response. Legionaries were taught to dehumanize the enemy and to suppress any empathy for their suffering, focusing instead on their own survival and the methodical execution of their duties. The unyielding gaze of a Roman legionary, fixed on his immediate objective, despite the surrounding chaos, was a product of this intense mental preparation. The brutal reality of this psychological conditioning meant that a soldier's primary emotional bond was to his fellow legionaries, a brotherhood forged in the crucible of battle, rather than any external morality. This intense camaraderie became a powerful force, driving them to protect their comrades at all costs, even while showing no mercy to their foes. The smell of battle was equally visceral and unforgettable. The coppery tang of fresh blood, the pungent odor of unwashed bodies, the acrid scent of fear, and the unavoidable stench of human waste. This olfactory assault added another layer to the overwhelming sensory experience of combat. To endure this unholy combination of sights, sounds, and smells required an almost superhuman level of mental fortitude and emotional detachment. The Roman legionary was not just a warrior. He was a meticulously crafted instrument of war, designed to function optimally even in the most nightmarish conditions. Their ability to remain cohesive and effective amid such chaos was a testament to the profound psychological conditioning inherent in the Roman military system, allowing them to transform the very elements that would shatter other armies into part of their terrifying advantage. The systematic training ensured that even the most primal human responses, like fear and disgust, were largely overridden by ingrained discipline and a collective sense of purpose. This relentless process of dehumanization, both of the enemy and of the soldier's own emotional self, was the cornerstone of Roman military success. Every clang of a blacksmith's hammer shaping a gladius, every shout of a centurion on the training ground, was part of a larger, deliberate design to create the perfect killing machine. The Roman military machine was built on the foundation of human sacrifice, not just of life, but of the very essence of humanity itself. This was the true cost of their dominance. Their psychological invincibility was their greatest weapon, a product of a system that demanded total suppression of the self for the good of the legion. If the gladius didn't get you, disease and infection very well might. Battlefields and ancient camps were ripe breeding grounds for pathogens. Simple wounds, if not immediately fatal, often led to agonizing deaths from gangrene, tetanus, or sepsis. Medical knowledge was rudimentary, and hygiene was non-existent by modern standards. A deep cut, a shattered bone, or even a festering blister could condemn a soldier to a slow, painful end long after the battle itself had concluded. The true death toll of a campaign often included far more victims of disease than combat. Wounds, particularly those from unsterilized weapons or dirt, were quickly colonized by bacteria. Lacking antibiotics, even a minor puncture could become a fatal infection. This constant exposure to bacteria and lack of antiseptic practices made even the smallest scratch potentially life-threatening for a Roman soldier. Campaigning meant living in close quarters, often with poor sanitation and limited access to clean water. This created ideal conditions for the rapid spread of infectious disease. diseases such as dysentery, typhus, and malaria. A single outbreak could decimate a legion more effectively than any enemy army. Food was often meager, monotonous, and sometimes spoiled, leading to malnutrition, which further weakened the soldiers' immune systems, making them more susceptible to illness. The constant physical exertion and exposure to the elements also took their toll, leaving legionaries exhausted and vulnerable. The cumulative effect of these factors meant that legionaries were almost constantly battling some form of illness, even when not directly engaged in combat. The medical support available to Roman soldiers, while perhaps advanced for its era, was still woefully inadequate to deal with widespread disease or severe injuries. Field surgeons could perform basic amputations or set bones, but they lacked understanding of germ theory. Instruments were not sterilized, and wounds were often dressed with materials that could introduce more pathogens. Many Roman campaigns were battles against the environment and unseen enemies as much as against human foes. The Punic Wars, for instance, saw huge losses to disease on both sides. The infamous Cimbrian War saw Roman armies struggling not only with fierce Germanic tribes, but also with the harsh winters and scarcity of resources that led to widespread illness. Therefore, survival in the Roman army was a constant gamble, with the unseen microbial world often proving to be a more persistent and insidious threat than the most formidable barbarian warrior. The logistical challenges of providing adequate medical care and maintaining sanitary conditions for thousands of men in diverse and often hostile environments were immense, often proving insurmountable. The Roman military's relationship with disease and sanitation was a complicated and often tragic one. While they were known for their engineering prowess, building aqueducts and baths in their permanent cities, these amenities were a luxury rarely afforded on the march. Armies on the move left behind a trail of filth and human waste, creating a perfect storm for the propagation of disease. Latrines were often nothing more than shallow pits dug near a camp, which when filled were simply covered over and a new one dug nearby. This rudimentary system, combined with a lack of personal hygiene practices, like washing hands, meant that fecal-oral diseases like dysentery were a constant scourge. The very act of marching could kick up dust contaminated with all manner of pathogens, which soldiers would then inhale or ingest with their food. The lack of clean water was perhaps the single greatest contributor to this cycle of sickness. While Roman engineers were masters of hydraulic systems, the reality of a field campaign meant that soldiers often had to drink from whatever source was available: a murky river, a stagnant pond, or a questionable well, all of which could be teeming with bacteria and parasites. Malaria was another persistent and deadly foe, particularly during campaigns in marshy or tropical regions. Without any understanding of mosquitoes as vectors, soldiers had no way to protect themselves. They would unknowingly set up camp in mosquito-infested lowlands, and within days, a fever would begin to spread, debilitating entire units. The debilitating fevers and chills of malaria would leave soldiers too weak to fight, march, or even stand guard, making them easy targets for the enemy or simply leaving them to die from exposure. The disease's cyclical nature meant that even if a soldier survived an initial bout, they could suffer relapses for years, making them permanently less effective as a fighting man. This was a critical factor in many of Rome's military setbacks, as commanders often had to contend with a significant portion of their force being incapacitated by this invisible enemy. The collective trauma of seeing comrades wasting away from an unknown illness added a profound layer of psychological burden to the already immense stresses of war. The Roman valetudinarium, or military hospital, represents a fascinating but ultimately limited attempt to address this issue. These were permanent structures, often located in large forts and camps, designed to provide a dedicated space for treating the sick and wounded. They featured individual rooms, surgical areas, and sanitation systems that were quite advanced for the time, including fresh water brought in by pipes. However, these were only available in established, long-term bases. For soldiers on the march or during a major campaign, medical care was far more makeshift. Capsari, or medics, would follow the army and provide what aid they could on the battlefield, but their knowledge was based on observation and experience, not scientific understanding. They could splint a broken bone or clean a wound with wine or vinegar, a surprisingly effective antiseptic, but they were powerless against systemic infections or widespread disease. The majority of a soldier's medical care was self-administered or provided by his tent mates, who had little to no formal training. This reliance on improvisation meant that survivability was often a matter of pure luck. A soldier with a strong constitution might shake off a fever that would kill his neighbor, or a shallow wound might heal while a deep but seemingly identical one would fester and lead to a grim and certain death. The sheer volume of casualties from disease meant that the Roman army was in a constant state of flux, with new recruits needing to be trained and deployed to replace those lost not just to battle, but to the insidious ravages of the unseen enemy. Roman discipline was legendary and sometimes terrifyingly brutal. In extreme cases of cowardice, mutiny, or widespread insubordination, legions could face decimation, a horrifying punishment where 1 in 10 men was randomly selected and beaten to death by his comrades. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about instilling absolute, unyielding fear and obedience. It was a stark reminder that your greatest danger could sometimes come from within your own ranks, reinforcing the idea that your life was utterly expendable for the greater good of the legion and the Roman state. The process itself was designed to maximize psychological impact. Lots were drawn, and the chosen few were then forced to run the gauntlet, beaten to death by their own fellow soldiers, who were compelled to participate to avoid similar fates or worse. Decimation was rarely employed, precisely because of its extreme nature, making its occasional use all the more impactful. It was a last resort, reserved for failures of collective discipline so severe that they threatened the very foundation of the Roman military ethos. The psychological trauma inflicted on those who survived, both the executioners and the witnesses, would have been immense. It forged a grim solidarity born of shared terror and complicity. This horrifying ritual served as an ultimate deterrent against any thought of rebellion or shirking duty. It underscored the absolute authority of the commanding officer and the state, demonstrating that individual lives were secondary to the integrity and effectiveness of the legion. Beyond decimation, Roman military law had a wide range of other harsh punishments, including flogging, reduction in rank, expulsion from the army, or even execution for individual transgressions. Vigilance was constant, and the smallest infraction could lead to severe penalties. This culture of strict discipline ensured that legionaries were highly responsive to commands, even in the chaos of battle. They understood that failure to obey or showing cowardice could lead to a fate worse than death at the hands of the enemy, a humiliating and brutal end at the hands of their own comrades. The Roman army's success was not just built on superior tactics and equipment, but on an ironclad system of discipline that instilled terror and loyalty in equal measure, making each legionary an unyielding cog in a vast and formidable war machine. This brutal system of discipline was a cornerstone of Rome's military might, and its effects rippled through every aspect of a soldier's life. The constant threat of severe punishment meant that legionaries were not only expected to be brave, but to act with an almost fanatical adherence to orders. A soldier who broke formation in the heat of battle, even to save his own life, could be punished. The penalty for desertion was often execution. This created an environment where soldiers relied on their comrades, not just for survival against the enemy, but for protection from the wrath of their own commanders. The bonds forged in the legion were thus a complex mix of camaraderie and a shared fear of authority. This was a system designed to eliminate individuality and elevate the needs of the collective above all else. The use of corporal punishment was widespread, and for minor offenses, a soldier could be subject to a beating with a fustus, a stick or cudgel, or a flagellum, a whip. These punishments were not just physically painful, but also deeply humiliating, serving as public reminders of a soldier's place in the rigid hierarchy. Officers and centurions had broad authority to mete out these punishments, and their severity often depended on the whim of the commander. This created a highly effective, if deeply oppressive, system of social control within the army. A centurion, for example, could be armed with a vetus, a vine staff which he was entitled to use to strike any soldier who failed to perform his duties with sufficient speed or diligence. This constant, low-level threat of physical punishment kept the soldiers perpetually on edge and ensured that tasks like digging trenches, building fortifications, or practicing maneuvers were carried out with maximum efficiency. The psychological impact of this discipline cannot be overstated. From the moment a recruit swore the military oath, the sacramentum, they were essentially ceding control over their body and life to the Roman state. They were taught that their existence was secondary to the glory and security of Rome. This indoctrination, combined with the constant threat of brutal punishment, created a psychological profile of a soldier who was willing to endure incredible hardship and face certain death without wavering. The Roman army was not just a collection of men. It was a highly conditioned, ruthlessly efficient killing machine. The discipline that enforced this was not a side note or a historical curiosity. It was the very engine of Rome's military dominance, a system so effective and so feared that it became the foundation of an empire that would last for centuries. The true strength of the Roman army lay not in individual heroism, but in its unyielding formations, particularly the testudo, tortoise. Imagine a moving armored box, shields interlocking on all sides and overhead, impervious to missile fire. This wasn't just a defensive tactic. It was a psychological weapon, a slow, relentless advance that crushed enemy morale. Individual bravery was secondary to the collective, synchronized movement of thousands of men acting as a single lethal entity. You were a cog in a human machine, and if you broke rank, you endangered everyone. The effectiveness of these formations stemmed from relentless training and the inherent discipline of the Roman legionary. Each man knew his place, his role, and his dependence on the man next to him. The scutum, the large rectangular shield, was designed specifically to interlock, creating a continuous barrier that could absorb incredible punishment from arrows, javelins, and slingshots. Beyond the testudo, the standard Roman battle line, composed of multiple lines of maniples or cohorts, also functioned as a highly disciplined and formidable human wall. The front ranks would engage while those behind provided support, pushed forward, or rotated to relieve exhausted fighters. This system of continuous pressure and controlled aggression was virtually unparalleled in the ancient world. The very sight of a Roman legion advancing in perfect order, shields glinting in the sun, must have been a terrifying spectacle, often enough to cause less disciplined armies to waver even before contact. The emphasis on collective action meant that individual fear or fatigue was subsumed into the larger unit's momentum. Breaking formation was anathema, punishable by severe penalties because it jeopardized the lives of every man in the unit. This created a powerful incentive for cohesion and adherence to discipline. The Roman soldier was taught that his survival and the victory of Rome depended on the unwavering integrity of the formation. This dedication to collective movement transformed individual soldiers into an almost impenetrable and inexorable force, capable of grinding down any opposition through sheer discipline and coordinated action. It was a tactical philosophy that prioritized the group over the individual, leading to a war machine that was as much a psychological weapon as it was a physical one, demoralizing enemies by its sheer, unbreakable resolve. If you fell on a Roman battlefield, your fate was often grim. The immediate aftermath of a battle was a terrifying free-for-all for scavengers. Not just animals, but camp followers, local civilians, and even surviving soldiers from both sides would descend upon the dead and dying, stripping them of armor, weapons, and any valuables. Bodies were often left to rot, unburied, creating grotesque landscapes that served as grim warnings. There was no dignity in death on a Roman battlefield, only exploitation and decay. The sheer scale of ancient battles meant that bearing every casualty was an immense logistical challenge, and often it simply wasn't a priority, especially for the losing side. The sight of carrion birds circling overhead and wild animals picking at remains was a common and horrifying reality of ancient warfare. For the victors, looting the dead was a common practice, a form of informal payment or a way to replenish equipment. For the defeated, their bodies were often left where they fell, a stark testament to their loss. This lack of proper burial was a deeply significant cultural violation for many ancient peoples. including the Romans themselves, who placed great importance on funeral rites and a proper transition to the afterlife. To be left unburied was considered a profound dishonor and a spiritual tragedy. The unburied dead also posed a significant health risk, contributing to the spread of disease and attracting more scavengers, creating a nightmarish landscape. These fields of the fallen served as grim monuments to the cost of conflict, visible for weeks or even months after a major engagement. The psychological impact on those who had to pass through or live near such sites must have been immense, a constant reminder of mortality and the brutal realities of war. The desecration of the dead was not just a practical consequence of battle. It was often a deliberate act of psychological warfare against the enemy, a visible sign of utter defeat and annihilation. It underlined the brutal and impersonal nature of Roman conquest, where even in death, the individual held little sanctity compared to the overall triumph of the legion. Beyond the physical wounds, the emotional and psychological toll of constant warfare was immense. While ancient Romans didn't have a concept of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in modern terms, the symptoms were undoubtedly prevalent. The constant fear, the loss of comrades, the brutality witnessed and inflicted, all left deep, unseen scars. Veterans often struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, haunted by the horrors they had endured. The cost of empire was paid not just in lives, but in shattered minds. Soldiers would have experienced hypervigilance, nightmares, flashbacks, and a general inability to cope with civilian routines after years of constant exposure to violence and the threat of death. The Roman concept of virtus, manliness, courage, would have compelled soldiers to suppress any outward signs of emotional distress, making it difficult to acknowledge or address these invisible wounds. A legionary was expected to be stoic, unyielding, and fearless. Any display of weakness, even psychological, would have been seen as a failing. This cultural pressure likely exacerbated the long-term psychological damage, as soldiers were denied avenues for processing their trauma. The constant demand for physical and mental resilience meant that there was little room for vulnerability. Many veterans received land grants upon retirement, often in newly conquered territories. While seemingly a reward, this also served to remove them from urban centers where their potentially erratic behavior might cause disruption, and place them in environments where their military skills could still be useful for maintaining control. These veterans, hardened by years of combat, would often form their own communities, perhaps finding solace in the company of those who understood their experiences. The Roman state, while not recognizing PTSD as a medical condition, certainly understood the need to manage its veterans, whether through integration or strategic placement. The echoes of their experiences, the vivid memories of carnage, and the profound changes wrought by years of fighting would have made a complete return to normal life an impossibility for many, leaving a lasting psychological footprint on countless individuals throughout the empire's long history. Amidst the unimaginable violence, there were profound bonds formed. In the intensely masculine world of the Roman legion, deep friendships were not uncommon. In an environment where men lived, fought, and died together for years, deep emotional intimacy could develop. These relationships, whether fleeting or enduring, provided solace, companionship, and perhaps even a form of brotherhood in a world designed to strip away all humanity. These were not just comrades. For some, they were everything. While official Roman morality might have frowned upon certain expressions of intimacy, the practical realities of military life often superseded societal norms. The extreme conditions of military service fostered an intense camaraderie. Men relied on each other for their very survival, creating bonds of loyalty and trust that ran deeper than those formed in civilian life. This close proximity, shared hardship, and constant threat of death could naturally lead to profound emotional connections. Historical sources, though often veiled, hint at the presence of such relationships. For instance, the renowned Sacred Band of Thebes, a Greek military unit composed entirely of close friends, showcased the belief that companions would fight more fiercely to protect each other. While the Roman legion was not structured in the same explicit manner, similar motivations could have applied. These relationships offered a crucial emotional anchor in a brutal and dehumanizing environment. In a world where families were far away and death was a constant companion, a deep personal connection provided comfort, support, and a sense of belonging. These bonds mitigated the crushing loneliness and fear inherent in constant warfare. They were a testament to the enduring human need for connection, even in the most extreme circumstances. While the Roman historical record might be largely silent on the explicit nature of these intimate relationships, their existence is a logical consequence of men living, fighting, and dying together over prolonged periods. They represent an often overlooked aspect of the legionary's life, a hidden source of strength and resilience amidst the relentless demands of the empire. You've witnessed a glimpse into the brutal, unromanticized reality of a Roman battlefield. It wasn't a place for heroes, but for survivors, and even then, survival was a coin toss against overwhelming odds. The disciplined ferocity of the legions, the unforgiving nature of the weapons, the sheer scale of the slaughter. It all points to one undeniable truth. A Roman battlefield was a one-way trip for most. So the next time you think about the glory of Rome, remember the screams, the stench, and the blood that soaked the earth. It wasn't just history, it was a living nightmare. If this descent into the stark reality of ancient warfare has gripped you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join us for more unvarnished truths from the annals of history. What other historical illusions are you ready to shatter?